Hello everyone. On behalf of AgriLinks and Feed the Future, I would like to welcome you to our Feed the Future webinar on commercialization opportunities for orange flesh sweet potato in 3 countries in Africa, Kenya, Malawi, and South Africa. My name is Aviva Kutnick, and I am with the USAID Bureau for Food Security, and I'll be your webinar facilitator today. So you'll hear my voice periodically, especially during the question and answer session. More than 800 people across the world go to bed hungry each night. As the global population grows, so do the opportunities and challenges associated with ending global hunger. Feed the Future, the U.S. government's Global Hunger and Food Security Initiative, is working to combat global hunger through partnership and innovation. One of those innovations is orange flesh sweet potato, also known by the acronym OFSP. Before we dive into the content of this webinar, I'd like to go over a few items to orient you. First, please do use the chat box to introduce yourself and let us know where you're joining from. We have many participants today from around the globe. Welcome to everyone. The chat box is your main way to communicate and participate throughout the webinar, and we encourage you to use it to post questions, share resources, and discuss the topic with your colleagues. We have several guest experts in the chat box today, Simone Heck and Tawanda Mzungi from the International Potato Center, based in Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome, Simone and Tawanda. Simone and Tawanda and many others from the International Potato Center, also known by the acronym SIP, were key partners and informants during this study. They work on a continual basis with development partners, governments, scientists, growers, and processors around the world to advance orange flesh sweet potato, varieties, seed systems, and market dissemination. Simone and Tawanda will be in the chat box throughout the webinar to prompt interesting questions and to provide answers on your technical questions on OFSP. We'll also be collecting your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll answer some of them along the way, and the rest will hold until after the presentation question and answer period. You'll see that the slides are available for download in the box on the left of your screen, as well as some other resources we'll be talking about today. Otherwise, we'll be advancing the slides as we move along the webinar. Lastly, on logistics, we are recording this webinar, and we'll email you the recording, transcripts, and additional resources once they're ready. They'll be posted on the AgriLinks event page, and we encourage you to share them widely. Okay, let's get started. So again, I'm Aviva Kutnick with the USAID Bureau for Food Security, and I work in our private sector engagement office, and I'm your facilitator today. Our other 2 main presenters are CJ Fanzi from Dalberg, and CJ is based in Kigali, Rwanda. And you can see his bio on the screen. His range of expertise is broad, including impact investing, agriculture, and SME finance and support. Caroline Nguyen, also from Dalberg, is our second primary presenter today. She's based in Johannesburg, South Africa, and she leads the Inclusive Business Expertise area and co-leads Dalberg's inclusive industrialization work and works to promote investment throughout Africa. Wonderful. So let's get started with a few more items of introduction. I'm going to review a few points on why orange flesh sweet potatoes and why USAID undertook this study on commercialization opportunities. As many of you know, orange flesh sweet potato is sometimes referred to as OFSP, and was developed by International Potato Center researchers and scientists to biofortified varieties of sweet potato with beta-carotene that produces vitamin A in the body. This is critical to food security, as vitamin A deficiency, particularly among expecting mothers and children under 5, can lead to compromised immune systems, blindness, and is associated with stunted growth. Just half a cup of boiled or mashed sweet potatoes, fortified, can meet the daily intake needs of a child under 5 years of age. These biofortified varieties are sweeter, easy to grow, and more nutritious. Sweet potatoes are widely consumed across Africa, and these root tubers are especially important related to risks and resilience. During periods of drought and times when maize and other staple harvest crops are threatened, often sweet potatoes will continue to grow and sustain communities. They are known as resilient crops, and along with other tubers, sometimes as famine foods. Over a decade of USAID support for OFSP at USAID has led to some critical questions about how this so-called miracle food can scale and expand into food systems generally. So we wanted to undertake this study of commercialization opportunities to better understand the donor and public sector role and potential private sector investment to catalyze this crop into food systems on a sustainable basis. And one way we wanted to do so was to examine the possibilities of food processing for orange flesh sweet potato. Taking a look at orange flesh sweet potato, we'll be focusing on just 3 countries today, Kenya, Malawi, and South Africa. But this slide provides an overview that the orange flesh sweet potato is available at different stages in many countries throughout Africa. While we'll be talking about orange flesh sweet potato today, looking at commercialization opportunities broadly is something that USAID has undertaken. USAID has a new policy on private sector engagement, where there's a mandate for USAID staff and partners to ask critical questions every time we approach a development or humanitarian issue. This is based on 3 questions. 1, asking ourselves, could there be a market-based approach to addressing this issue? 2, what are the roles and interests of the private sector in addressing this issue? And 3, are there factors constraining the private sector from involvement and investment? We understand that development dollars and public sector resources cannot do this alone, and that in Africa, there's more and more commercial investment that will really catalyze changes and positive growth in the food security space. Finally, I want to talk just a moment about USAID's Investment Support Program, which is the project that this study was undertaken under. So the program works in 6 areas, and today we're going to be looking primarily at number 1, which is investment identification and promotion. Okay, now we're ready to switch over to Caroline for the bulk of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Aviva, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today, and thank you so much for joining. And thank you for that great introduction as to the importance and the relevance of orange flesh sweet potato, which means that I'm actually, if I can operate these slides, yes, going to skip this first slide, which outlines the benefits for farmers, for consumers, and for the food industry, because Aviva has done a great job at doing it. And I'm going to start with a little bit of a cold shower, which was our task on this particular engagement. The focus for our work and the focus for today is on investment facilitation, not on food security, not on crop fortification, but on the ability to crowd in sizable private sector money to take this to scale. And that requires you to take a slightly different lens from what you might be used to normally. So we wanted to take you through that so that you can put the right glasses on for the conversation today. So firstly, sorry, my presentation is slow. There we go. So as Aviva already showed in the slides earlier, the uptake and growth of orange flesh sweet potato has been very impressive, quite unlike any other crop. And much of the praise for that should go to SIP, who has worked tirelessly with partners across the continent to actually introduce this crop and get farmers to grow it and consumers to consume it. So given that, the natural next step is to then look at what are large-scale commercial plays as we want this flywheel to spur growth. So you really want to draw in private sector investors that can then generate a bigger demand, which creates a pool for more farmers to grow OFSP for a bigger part of their plots with higher yields, better incomes, better food security, etc. The ISP program that Aviva spoke about focuses on investment facilitation, and the nature of investment pulls for opportunities for larger small medium enterprises and up. So this is not about micro opportunities. This is not about a few farmers that can use the Harvesters OFSP to bake cookies and sell on their local market, because that won't draw in the investment funding that this project asks us to look at. That doesn't mean that there's no potential and viability for that kind of innovation, and that there's no opportunity for livelihood improvement for people involved in that kind of work. It just was not the ask for the piece of work for us today. To find those kind of investment opportunities, the ISP team focused on three things: demand, a viable business case for processors of OFSP, and a viable business case for farmers. Obviously, for this to have commercial and developmental impact, both processors that are the main investors in this space should see a case to move in, but it should also continue to make sense for farmers from a livelihood perspective. So we also continue to look at what the revenues per hectare will be when farmers grow OFSP and how that compares to other crops that they could grow. This approach very much links to the three questions that Aviva earlier outlined with the new private sector engagement approach that USAID is using. Today, we invite you to put on the hat of an investor who is expecting a return on investment with an acceptable risk. And that is not an easy task for us as development professionals. We often forget the commercial risk, and we see the opportunity, but we don't necessarily see the risk that it can go wrong. And we don't take into account that to be able to accept such a risk, investors expect a higher return on their investment. Help yourself and be tough, and specifically do what we call the savings litmus test. When you hear about these opportunities, think for yourself, how would I feel if my pension savings were invested in this space? Would I be comfortable? Would I be excited? Or would I actually feel a bit jittery because this doesn't quite feel fully sustainable? That's a nice test to take today, because that is the kind of questions that investors are going to ask when we invite them to join these kind of opportunities in these markets. Of course, we couldn't only be tough. So we also identified opportunities that are less commercially viable, and knowing that they may only align with the objectives of impact-driven anchor buyers. So as we go through the findings on a country-by-country basis, my colleague CJ will point out some of those, but that distinction has been one that has been very important in our work. So with that context setting, let me take you through the definition of two concepts that we use continuously throughout this work. One is a business opportunity, and the other is a commercial scale investment. A business opportunity that you see on the left-hand side, very well helped by this green arrow that's popping up on our screen, reflects an opportunity to access a market and operate profitably. So it answers the question, can a business be run? That can be a very small-scale business. So think again about that example I gave earlier about a couple of farmers boiling the OFSP maybe on their farm and baking it into products that they sell on the local market. If they make money out of that, great. That's a business opportunity. It can be small, it can be local, it can be niche. It doesn't have to drive scale. It was not what we were asked to look at. What we were asked to look at was what you see on the right-hand side, which is a commercial scale investment, which is an opportunity that both operates profitably as a business opportunity, but can also generate scale that is large enough, or can generate large enough free cash flows to cover the cost of getting involved. So it has a positive answer to the question, is it worth investing into? Because it does take time and effort for investors to unlock capital, to look at opportunities, to consider them, to get engaged, to get knowledgeable about a topic, about the area, and all of that is only worth if it hits not just a minimal return, but also a minimum size for them to come to the table. So that was really the filter with which we looked at the opportunities that we came along. Now, as you see on this slide, which is a very busy and wordy slide, and I won't go through the details, but you can download the presentation and look at it later. But I'm also sure that many of you on the call know this information. OFSP can be used in many different ways. There's obviously the fresh use, where you use the roots in raw, boiled, baked, or steamed form. But the focus for our work was mostly on the processed use, simply because that's where most of the investment opportunity materializes. And there's basically two categories in processed use. One is where it's still recognizable as sweet potato. So it can be potato puree, baby foods, sweet potato crisps, juice, some other baked goods. And then there's opportunities where it's not necessarily visible and recognizable as sweet potato. That's in some of the baked goods. It really depends on how much of the wheat you replace by sweet potato to be able to determine whether it's sort of invisible or not. But you can also use it as a starch in yogurt, for example, which is a very invisible use of the sweet potato. And then there's some opportunities for non-human consumption, particularly on animal feed, where, frankly, it's mostly the stalks and the leaves rather than the roots. The roots can also be fed to animals, but that's usually not the strongest business case. And it has, in some cases, been identified as an opportunity for input for biofuels. So those are the kind of users that you can think about when you think processed OFSP and investment opportunities. Then we asked ourselves, how can you grow these processing volumes? Because they're currently quite low. Most of OFSP that is grown in these countries is consumed fresh. And to be able to create the demand for that processing, you have to think about what drives the growth of processing volumes. And there's really three ways, and only three ways. And we had to continue looking at those in all of the countries. The first is with that visible use of products, if buyers, if consumers change their habits and their behavior in favor of products that contain OFSP in a noticeable way. So either retail consumers start buying OFSP, like bread that has a certain degree of OFSP in it, or OFSP chips instead of regular potato chips, or institutional buyers start using OFSP and OFSP products. And when we say institutional buyers, you can think about schools, food feeding programs, prison systems, military feed, like the big buyers that buy food at a very large scale. The challenge with that as a way to grow the use of orange fresh sweet potato is that this requires a change in behavior. And as many of us on this call know, changing people's behavior is very difficult and takes a lot more than telling people it's good for them to change their behavior. We all know our diets, our ideal diets would look quite different from what we're currently consuming probably. Our ideal exercise regime would be different from what we're currently doing. And just telling us over and over again doesn't change our behavior. So this actually relies on people changing their individual buying behavior, which is no small feat. So therefore, the second and the third are actually more interesting opportunities to look at. The second is producers switching to using OFSP in invisible applications, so as a starch in yogurt, for example. That doesn't require any behavior change from the buyers, from the ultimate consumers, so that's no concern of the producers in that case. And all that you need to be able to show is that's actually worth it for them. So it's either a big cost saving or something else that they can benefit from. But the more it's invisible, the more it's probably cost saving and processing ease that would win them over. The third category is to get producers who already work with OFSP to include OFSP from Malawi, Kenya, or South Africa. But this requires actually no change in the product composition, but it requires buyers to say, hey, I could buy these products from these three countries rather than from any other countries that they come from in the world. What that obviously requires is an international competitiveness. So each of those have their own pros and cons and their own challenges in getting them right. On this particular piece of work, let me just go a few slides forward and then come back to the other ones. We looked particularly at OFSP as a partial replacement for wheat in bread. You can replace up to 50% of the wheat in bread by an OFSP puree, which has benefits in terms of a more secure supply chain. So most countries actually import a lot of their wheat, so they're very dependent upon foreign wheat supply and upon their exchange rates as well, whereas if you can use locally grown OFSP, you acquire more of an independence. It may, in some cases, not always, yield a cost saving, and it has some benefits to the product. It does change the product. It changes the texture, it makes it a bit softer, it makes it more shelf stable. In most cases, consumers have indicated that they prefer that. It changes the color. Some people describe it as gold, other people describe it as orange. Whether or not people prefer that over the current look and feel of bread is obviously up to the consumer's preference, and it's some of the things that we did look into. Why did we look so carefully at bread and not at any of the, well, we looked at other opportunities as well, but bread was really our starting point when we looked at processing opportunities. And that's mainly because, A, wheat is so much of an imported staple in many of these countries, and 70 to 80% of the wheat goes into bread baking. So if you can actually find an alternative for as an ingredient into bread, that actually affects a big part of your wheat flows. More importantly, though, use of OFSP ingredients in other products tends to be either a much smaller ingredient or overall a much smaller market. So in bread, you can replace up to 50% of your wheat by OFSP. In many of the other products, either cookies or, for example, starch in yogurt, obviously not 50% of your yogurt volume and weight is starch. So you cannot absorb as much OFSP volume in those other products because OFSP just would be a much smaller ingredient in the overall product, and therefore, by default, a smaller market opportunity. And then on top of that, many of the other products that OFSP could go into are consumed in much lower volumes than bread is. People eat less cookies than they eat bread. People eat less potato chips than they eat bread. So for all of those reasons, processing OFSP as a wheat replacement in bread is a great first opportunity to look into. It's also relatively technically simple compared to some of the other opportunities. And bread baking tends to be done in a relatively concentrated industry, so you don't have to convince hundreds upon hundreds of smaller processors to start taking on this product. There's usually a few big bakers in a country that bake most of the processed bread. So if you can bring them along, you can actually win quite a bit. I skipped over a few slides, and I'll go back to them now. As you see on this slide, typically the evolution of the use of OFSP is from subsistence to commercial business opportunities, but not necessarily industrial scale, to industrial scale. And if you look at the various different countries, not surprisingly, Malawi mainly has subsistence use with some very early commercialization, commercial use. Kenya is on track towards sort of more commercial use, and South Africa has the whole range from subsistence all the way to industrialization. So that's where the countries currently sit, and we were looking predominantly, again, at investment opportunities on that industrial stage. To be able to do so, we looked at 3 things per country, and that will close my section, and then CJ will look at the individual countries. First of all, we looked at the demand and the opportunity for OFSP processing. So taking all of the things into account I spoke about earlier, how can you grow demand by making people switch over, or by producers using it in invisible products, or by producers starting to use it from your countries. How big are those markets? How attractive would OFSP be compared to what people are currently either consuming or using in terms of ingredients? And what do processors on top of that state as barriers to uptake for OFSP? This was an important part of the work that we did. We didn't just do a desk analysis of the cost of OFSP compared to wheat, but we actually went out and spoke to producers and said, what would it take for you to switch over? And not surprisingly, there needs to be a pretty big advantage for processors to make a change to what they're currently doing. Because changing always takes an effort, it always comes with a certain risk. So the advantage needs to be quite substantial, and if the advantage is too marginal, then processors will say, no, thank you, I won't take that risk. Then the second thing we looked at was success factors for realizing identified opportunities. So if there is a business case for processing OFSP, what would be required to realize that case? And what elements would need to be addressed to kickstart an opportunity? And then thirdly, obviously, we came up for air, synthesized that into true investment recommendations, and seeing for the identified commercial scale investment opportunities, what investment size would be needed and what other considerations should be made. I don't know if it was by design, but the 3 countries that we looked at were very, very different. And were very different they're obviously different in their sort of stage of development, structure of the economy, general wealth, how agriculture is organized, and all of that reflects in the opportunities that we found for OFSP. So very excited to take you through the specific countries, which CJ will do, but we may need to pause for questions if there are any on the approach that we took.
Great, turning it over to CJ, who's based in Kigali, Rwanda.
Excellent. Thank you, Aviva, for the great introduction, and Caroline for the great setup. I am going to move fairly quickly. We have a lot of content here on 3 countries, and so apologies for moving somewhat quickly through these stories, but I'm moving fast so that I can save time for questions. So if you do have questions, please do write them down so that we can discuss them. And I'm also told that the webinar will be available for download within a week. So if there's slides you want to look at a bit more or poke into, they'll certainly be there and available for that. So the story we're going to tell here is a bit of a Goldilocks story, and I think Caroline alluded to that. I think we're looking at some countries that may be a little too small or a little too early stage. One country in particular that held several opportunities actually for commercialization in OFSP, and one country that was perhaps a little bit too big or too advanced for some of the work that we might do here. And I'm going to start and actually spend a bit more time on Kenya than some of the other countries or the other 2 countries we looked at, because we did see a number of opportunities in Kenya. And in Kenya we saw, I think, 2 commercial investment opportunities, and I think we saw the opportunity for those to really increase farmer incomes and generate quite a bit of potential impact for producers. And so thinking about producers, we actually struggled quite a bit to pin down a farm gate price for OFSP. We saw numbers from FAO that were very high. We saw and very variable. We saw numbers from the Ministry of Agriculture in Kenya that were closer together, but seemed much higher than what we'd even read in newspaper sources or talking to farmers about their experiences. As we talked to processors about what they pay for OFSP, we saw that they were much lower actually than what some of the international sources had said. And so working with the folks at SIP and looking at some of the data and experiences that they've had, as well as looking at the price that one current OFSP processor is paying, we used a fairly conservative price of 140 USD per ton of OFSP in Kenya. And with this conservative price, I think we'll see on the left of this slide, we can still see a fairly substantial farmer income increase with an average yield if that farmer were to be producing orange flesh sweet potatoes rather than maize. And so I think that this really helps to underline why in Kenya we would want to find a commercialization opportunity for OFSP. Yes, there's some nutritious food impacts, particularly if it's consumed by certain populations within the Kenyan economy, but really big opportunity here to increase incomes and thus food security for smallholder farmers in Kenya. I will say that this increase in income comes with a big risk, right? I think, and as we look at farmers, we look at their choice over and over again to grow things like maize instead of crops that we know can fetch a higher farm gate price. It really comes down to controlling their own destiny. And so a farmer knows that if they grow maize, they can dry that maize and they can feed that maize to their family throughout the year. Whether or not it's enough to eat or it's nutritious is another question, but they know they've got that basic necessity covered. Now, as we ask a farmer to switch to sweet potatoes, we're asking them to take a bit of risk because, as we know, sweet potatoes can't last all year. And, looking at the price variability, they may not be fully convinced that they would fetch this price if they were to sell them. That's an important backdrop to have as we think about these opportunities. They need to be robust and they need to work because we're talking about the incomes of some of the poorest producers. Looking at Kenya, the demographics of Kenya, it really is a country that's got a rapidly growing middle class. The middle and upper classes in Kenya still represent less than 8% of the economy, but it's growing quite rapidly, 7% per annum. And as we look at the consumption of processed food, and as Caroline pointed out, the key opportunity we're seeing right now for processed OFSP or commercial scale OFSP investment is in processed food domestically. We see that it's really primarily the upper and middle classes that consume that. So that's an encouraging story for Kenya. We've got a growing upper and middle class, and we know that those are the classes that consume the majority of processed food and bread and baked goods. But again, as Caroline noted in the setup, it's probably not enough to switch, to simply have people have a market for it. We need to believe that that market will demand this product, and we need to believe that there will be demand-side advantages for a given product. And so we look deeply at on the supply side, whether there would be cost savings for bakeries to switch to use OFSP, or whether there would be some type of other advantages, perhaps around price stability by switching 50% of their wheat to a different product. On the demand side, advantages seem to be a potential benefit in taste and texture, although as we interviewed people, we heard kind of both sides. Some folks really liked the orange bread with the texture. Others felt that it was a bit non-traditional, but certainly there's a market for that. And increasingly a health-conscious class. And as we see that upper and middle class grow, there may be reasons to believe that there is a health-conscious class. And so as we look at some more demographics around Kenya, we are seeing communicable disease on the decline, non-communicable disease on the incline. We're seeing people become more health conscious. We're seeing a number of healthy brands begin to be established and take hold in Nairobi and across Kenya. And so there's reason to believe that consumers may begin to, at least to some extent, favor or not shy away from an orange flesh sweet potato product on its health merits. And further supporting that is the fact that, you know, the first real case, commercial case we've seen of OFSP bread is being sold by one of the large grocers in Kenya, Custom. And so that's a bit of a reason to believe that there's at least some demand. They're certainly selling some of this bread. Now on the supply side, one of our hypotheses coming in was that OFSP could be cheaper. And as we actually look at it, you'll see on the chart here to the left, the current price of OFSP is actually more expensive than making bread with purely wheat. It turns out that's a bit of an anomaly at the moment. It's primarily due to a historically low price of wheat in Kenya, which, by the way, does not track against global trends. Global trends have been fairly consistent, whilst there's been a bit of a price war on wheat production in Kenya. So we do believe that it is possible with innovation, and if this trend were to come right, well, with innovation alone, we believe it's possible for OFSP price to become less than that of the current wheat-only price for bread production. And we believe that as this historic trend sort of stops and probably reverses around wheat flour prices, it's possible that OFSP could become much more inexpensive than using wheat to produce bread. And on this slide, we've tried to show that graphically. So we can see that for a long time, up until just a few years ago, it would have been much more expensive to produce bread using wheat flour vis-a-vis using OFSP puree. Then we see that that sort of crossed in the last few years. And we see this period where actually the wheat flour bread is cheaper. But given the two things that we've noted on the previous slide, we think that that's very temporary and likely to reverse, and probably to reverse fairly significantly. And so again, we see this dotted blue line. Investments in more cost-effectively producing orange flesh sweet potato puree, we believe could reduce the cost of making bread from that by a full 33%. So again, dropping OFSP bread down to already being cheaper than bread made wholly with wheat flour. And then again, as we see wheat flour prices come in line with global norms and the somewhat odd price trends of the last few years stabilize, we think that space between the cost of OFSP bread and wheat flour bread could continue to grow. So we were actually quite encouraged that on the supply side, in a mid to long term, with a commercial scale, we could actually see a cost saving in OFSP wheat flour. And so that led us to the question of how big could this market be? And so this is a tough spot. It's tough to estimate how much market share one would get. And it depends on a few things. It depends on how distinguishable OFSP is in bread and in the different bread products that are offered. It depends on how receptive the market is to this new product. Again, we believe that there is a subsegment of the market that would be very interested and attracted to the product on its health merits, and perhaps another subsegment that would be attracted based on its taste or flavor. Certainly, given that it is more cost-effective to produce, we believe that would either incentivize producers of bakeries, producers of bread, to push OFSP because their margins would be greater, or to reduce the price on OFSP bread, passing some of that savings along to customers and in the process spurring demand. So we've used an 8% assumption of market share. That's ironically exactly what we were seeing in the Tuskegee bakeries. And we actually ran a bit of a research project where we went out and validated that OFSP was selling, and it was selling at about 8% as claimed. And so we thought that actually represented a pretty good guess for what percent of the Kenyan market could be captured, or the Kenyan bread market could be captured by OFSP bread. And so running a few numbers and understanding the implications of that could be about a $5 million business today. Now, to Carline's setup on what it takes for a commercial investment opportunity, 5 million market is a big enough market for one to envisage being able to make investments in fixed assets or investments in businesses to serve that market, where one could cover their transaction costs and bring home a reasonable return. By a commercial investor's lens, it's still small, but it is a sufficiently large market to justify some early commercial activity. And now, remembering back to the growth of the middle class and the demographic shifts that we're seeing in Kenya, as well as the increased focus on health, we believe that this market will grow over time, and thus we believe that this is a commercial investment opportunity, and perhaps an attractive one. Now, to understand the impact side of that, if we were to shift 8% of Kenyan's bread consumption to OFSP bread, that would impact about 1,300 or almost 1,400 smallholder farmers. And again, when we looked at the impact of almost tripling their incomes, that's a fairly substantial impact. So in order to actually see and believe that this is possible, there's a range of market fundamentals that would have to be the case. And again, I think we've sort of validated that none of them are not achievable, although some of them in particular could be a little bit hard. I think some of the technology innovations and convincing some of the bakers and bakeries to make this switch, particularly at a time when it would be, on its face look like a more expensive switch in the near term, are achievable, but are not will take some effort and will take some focus. So we did look at other opportunities around local consumption of OFSP in Kenya. Specifically, we looked at potato crisps, French fries, baby food, and a range of foods that were similar to these. And I think the story here was one of small markets and or expensive production, or both in the case of potato crisps. But what we found was in potato crisps, because of actually the shape and size and texture of a sweet potato, it would be more expensive due to excess waste and additional machinery used to create potato crisps. It's also a very small market. With French fries, we found that actually could be an interesting niche market. It's certainly a way to infuse some health into a product that's seeing a lot of market growth right now. but it's actually only the very high income segment of Kenyans that are consuming French fries, and it's a very, very tiny market at this point. We saw the same with baby food. Again, just very, very, very small market. So even though it's a nutritious product and an opportunity, it's a long way from a commercial scale investment in Kenya right now. Another interesting thing to look at is opportunities in export. And so one of the things that struck us was that in Kenya, there's a real opportunity to grow and export orange flesh sweet potatoes primarily to Europe, although the Middle East could also be an interesting target. And if we look at the chart on the bottom of this slide, we see astronomical growth in the consumption of OFSP. I believe that these numbers are for the UK, but we saw similar consumption across much of mainland Europe. And so we're seeing a real market demand there. And as we looked at some of the cost structures of producing and packaging and transporting OFSP from Kenya, which again has a robust commercial port in Mombasa, it's actually quite an attractive margin, perhaps greater than 50% is possible. Importantly, a couple of recent innovations have made this more possible and probably more profitable. One has been the introduction of chilled shipping containers in the port in Mombasa. This is something that surprisingly has only recently become fully possible on a smaller scale basis through rentals of shipping containers in Mombasa. And similarly, fumigation costs and techniques have evolved as well over the last few years, and there's now reason to believe that one could viably fumigate and ship OFSP from Kenya to mainland Europe. So similarly, we saw with processed food an opportunity to export to Europe as well. Using a baby food example, we were able to show that producing this baby food in Kenya, which due to labor costs would obviously be less expensive than producing the food in the UK or Europe, and shipping this to Europe could still provide a fairly hefty margin. Believe it or not, it would face a serious import tariff of almost a third, but the cost advantages are so strong that one would be able to ship that product still at almost a 50% margin. So also a very interesting commercial investment opportunity. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through a few slides here, but we looked at what it would mean for USAID to support investors to actually take advantage of these opportunities. And there's a range of production challenges around supply, aggregation, et cetera, that are currently making it hard for processors to use OFSP or exporters to export. And then there's a range of things that USAID could do through windows like the ISP window to support investors and to support these value chains to prepare them for investment. Similarly, there's a range of needs that processors have to prepare some of these investments, and there's ways that a donor like USAID could step in to help prepare some of the processing markets for something like this OFSP opportunity. And then finally, my last slide on Kenya. We just wanted to say that, it was interesting as we talked to potential off-takers or potential commercial actors in Kenya, they really aligned across three sort of groups. There were some that were already interested in piloting the use of OFSP. There were others, and I would say this was the bulk of those that we talked to, that sat in the middle. And so we'd try that if you can help mitigate some of our risk early on, or you can demonstrate for us that this can be effective. And then there were some folks that just were non-believers and stood to the side. But overall in Kenya, we felt that there was an opportunity to convince producers to take this on. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on Malawi now. And as we noted, Malawi is a case of perhaps a bit too small. The opportunity for processors is pretty small. It's a nascent market, and as we'll see, one that may not justify commercial investment. Export from Malawi is hard. Again, Malawi is a small landlocked country, that would have to go through countries that are also quite good OFSP producers, like Tanzania, to get to a shipping port. However, we did continue to see some real opportunities for producers alongside health opportunities. And so again, similar stories to Kenya. In fact, even more dramatic in Malawi, given the number of growing seasons. Malawi typically only has one. Shifting from maize to sweet potatoes can be a radical increase in farmer incomes. And so to the extent that we can find a way to move farmers into sweet potato production reliably, it could be very important for them around their incomes, which can certainly lead to food security. Of course, the same risks apply as in Kenya, where if you move someone away from maize, which can be dried and eaten all year, you do need to ensure that the market linkages are there consistently so that that income increase can be realized and that money can be used to purchase food for a family, particularly in Malawi where you've got fewer growing seasons and so much more risk of a hunger season. So there were sort of two key themes that we kept hearing in our interviews in Malawi. And one was processors saying, it's tough to get a hold of good, high quality potatoes. I don't know if the supply is there. We saw this as a very surmountable barrier. I think a lot of the work that SIP and others have been doing is already taking hold. And increasingly, we're seeing supply getting better and better and better. The more concerning thing that we heard from a range of the processors in Malawi was that the business case was a bit weak. They weren't convinced. We were told by one producer there, and this is a story we've told many times, that they were really interested in trying out orange flesh sweet potatoes, and they were willing to try it if a donor would buy them a bun cutter. And we inquired, why is a bun cutter important? I think it's important. What is it about a bun cutter that makes OFSP work? And they confided in us, well, nothing. We just don't think OFSP will work, and we really want a bun cutter. So, at least we'll get our bun cutter if we try this. I think that's a sign that we may be pushing industry to partner with us, perhaps too much, or in a case where there's maybe not the most viable business case. A bit of background on Malawi helps to understand what we were seeing, and I think important and from a development sector lens, concerningly, we've seen some real decreases in incomes in Malawi in the last sort of 5+ years. We've really seen the GDP per capita of a Malawian go down, and related to that, we've seen the size of the upper middle class is actually decreasing while we've seen the lower class increase. And so again, if you remember our analysis on who consumes processed food, and particularly bread, it's not a good thing to see the upper middle class market shrinking. That makes it hard to believe that there would be a business case in bread. And so as we ran the numbers, looking at this, we used a generous 10% market share, which is actually even higher than we used in Kenya. We sort of attempted to predict the market for OFSP bread in Malawi. And using the rosiest of examples, we could only come up with a market of about $1 million annually. Now that is not necessarily not an interesting business case. Coming back to the definitions that were presented around a business case and an investment case, it could be the case that $1 million market is interesting for a small cottage industry, for a producer who's already there to tiptoe into something new. But it's certainly not going to attract commercial scale investment. And particularly given that it's shrinking, it's unlikely to be a market that is going to generate a significant impact in the years to come. In fact, we found in Malawi that probably the most exciting case would be to just increase raw consumption of raw OFSP. It's very healthy. Ironically, it's actually eaten more in Malawi than in either of the other two countries we looked at already. But there's still a dramatic opportunity to increase. We see that, urban Malawians eat OFSP once or never, for more than half urban Malawians. Rural Malawians eat it even less frequently. And given its cost per calorie advantages and its nutritional advantages, there's a real opportunity there. And so our recommendation was, in Malawi, it makes a lot more sense for folks to consider donor-driven activities or other activities focused on increasing consumption, perhaps through school lunches or through other opportunities. Now, the last country we'll go to, and this one is a very quick consideration, is South Africa. And as we looked at South Africa, on its face, it looked like a very, very attractive opportunity. We saw, again, an opportunity for moderate cost savings for processors. We saw, again, a big export opportunity, almost as big as Kenya. And additionally, we saw an opportunity for smallholder farmers, if they were to produce OFSP, to potentially increase their livelihood. One point as we began to study the production of OFSP in South Africa that we discovered is that the current yield was only about 3 tons per hectare, which was dramatically less than smallholder farmers even in Malawi were getting, much less than Kenya. And that shocked us. And so as we began to study what was going on there, we discovered that, A, South Africa has very few smallholder farmers. B, those that exist have already been diverted into higher value crops for local consumption. And that C, there's not much of an opportunity to grow OFSP with smallholder farmers. However, we did find a number of agronomists that were very excited about the opportunity to attain yields of up to 25 tons per hectare, which is much higher than we saw in either of our countries, by leveraging South Africa's commercial agriculture industry. As we looked at farm gate prices, we also saw prices that were potentially higher than we saw in East Africa, driven by substantial local market consumption, as well as already very small presence of exporting of this. So this became interesting to us as we thought that there might be an opportunity here. As we began to size the market for bread, which is an interesting market in South Africa, by the way, because the majority of bakeries are vertically integrated into wheat processing, and thus they have a cost advantage. So it's only a small segment, a niche segment of less than half of the bakery market that we would be able to convince maybe to move to OFSP. And perhaps it could be interesting for that market to give them some level of distinction, and it would mitigate the price advantage that some of their competitors have on wheat. So as we began to look at that, however, we again saw the trends that we're so used to seeing around it actually being middle and high income consumers that are eating bread. And so as we sat back and we laid out the business case that we were seeing in South Africa, we said, okay, we think that we can help increase incomes for commercial farmers, and in doing so, we can generate a product that will be consumed primarily by wealthy South Africans and could potentially also be exported to Europe. And I think we had to admit there that there was very little impact case left or case through which to attract a development actor. And so I wish the commercial sweet potato industry in South Africa well, but I don't think it's a key focus for us as development actors moving forward. So that wraps up our formal presentation here, and again, apologies for moving so quickly through so many of these, but we are keen to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, CJ, for the presentation on the 3 countries, Kenya, Malawi, and South Africa. First, I'd like to draw everyone's attention to some of the links in the box on the left of your screen, the first of which is Value Added Food Month on AgriLinks. This webinar is part of a suite of blogs, postings on various topics, all related to value-added foods. And what we mean by value-added foods, that includes crops or foods that have been enhanced through various improvements, including processing, fortification, increased safety, nutrition, or better packaging for extended storage. And the benefits include providing better nutrition, particularly to children and mothers, greater income for producers, for the farmers or small-scale processors and traders involved in that supply chain, as well as access to new markets. as well as new processes to improve packaging and storage, reducing waste to ensure greater food safety. One of the really interesting innovations that I think CJ brought up during the presentation is new advancements in cold storage and especially in chilled transport that could potentially be making major gains in terms of reducing costs in terms of getting processed or fresh foodstuffs from African markets to the international market. So wanted to draw your attention there. We've had a very robust chat window during this webinar, so thanks very much for everyone who's participated. Keep your questions coming, and we'll have some time right now to address those questions, Carline and CJ live, and of course Tawanda, as he's been doing in the chat box. Thank you so much, Tawanda. So I'll go ahead and kick off with a question generally. So thank you very much, Carline and CJ. I wanted to ask, this methodology, we've really gone in deep talking about orange flesh sweet potato, but more broadly, how is this methodology on commercial opportunities? How do you see it applied generally as development professionals look to scale technologies and particular crops and food systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Aviva. And one of the reasons why we took somewhat longer to explain to you how we were thinking about this and why we looked at certain parts of the potential set of applications and not others was to actually illustrate this methodology. This approach is very suitable to be applied to other products, other crops. In fact, we have already applied variations of this in a few different settings, most of it with ISP as well, and been able to either unlock some significant investment, particularly in the edible oil sector in Tanzania, that had been in a bit of a gridlock until we took much more of a demand and investor approach and were able to identify what truly stood in the way and help overcome that and bring an investor in. Or in some other cases, being able to actually help dispel the myth or burst the bubble of something that just isn't ready for private sector investment and then doesn't warrant a continued donor or government engagement in trying to drag the private sector along when they're not ready to move forward. So I think this methodology really helps you to identify where are those sweet spots where there is a need to unlock something or to bring some partners together, where are areas that actually are about to kick off already, move out of their own accord and just need you applauding by the sidelines and stepping in as and when some help is needed, and where there are areas that fundamentally are not yet or may never be viable opportunities for private sector investment.
Great, thank you. And that also helps us as development professionals prioritize and understand where public sector dollars can be invested and where private sector dollars can be facilitated or catalyzed or not. So it really, that methodology really helps us in terms of knowing what elements we should be supporting in various crops and technologies. Okay, wonderful. Now we'll turn to some of the questions from the chat box now. Looking at the question from Maiwish Muradia, asks, did the study authors look into consumer preferences and willingness to pay or purchase for orange flesh sweet potato based processed products? For example, the bread example that we went into in Kenya. So I'll turn that question over to Carline.
A little bit. It wasn't the core focus of our work, and we predominantly tried to answer that question through understanding what the processors and the producers of these products felt about it, because ultimately what matters when they're about to make a decision whether or not to put a product on the market is what they believe about the consumer preferences. We did actually look at the bread in Kenya, which was already on the market in Tuskegee supermarket. There was we actually sent out researchers a couple of days to just simply count the number of loaves on the shelves in a number of Tuskegee supermarkets at different times of the day to confirm that A, the product was available, and B, it was actually being sold. So we had people go in morning, afternoon, and evening to count the number of loaves. And with that, we're able to confirm what Tuskys had been sharing as their sort of sales volume. The reason we did that, and the reason we didn't just take Tuskys' word for it, was related to a dynamic that CJ already described around the bun cutter in Malawi. There is a reality where private sector actors are not oblivious of the fact that development agencies want them to come to the table and are keen to have development support and know that there's money on the table for that. So they do sometimes have an incentive to play things up a little and make an opportunity look somewhat bigger so that they get more support in making it real. So with that in mind, we didn't just take Tuskys' word for it, and we actually went and checked and confirmed that the order of magnitude estimate that they gave around their sales was correct. We did not go out and research and ask individual consumers because what we wanted to look at was proven buying behavior rather than stated preferences. If you go out and ask people and have them taste products or ask them about products they have, there is a whole deep body of research that says there isn't the biggest link between what people state they want to buy and what they actually buy. You see that a lot in sort of fair trade products when people say what's the premium they're willing to buy for those products, and then you look at actual buying behavior and they're accepting a much lower premium. So stated preferences is not the best predictor for actual buying behavior, so we stayed as close to actual buying behavior as we possibly could.
Great, thank you, Caroline. Looking at another question coming in on Nigeria. So it's true, this study focused on 3 countries, and it was no accident. We did intentionally choose countries of various size, market size, in different states of economic development in order just to broadly define some typologies for where there may or may not be opportunities for large-scale commercialization of orange flesh sweet potato. So a question came in on Nigeria, and though we didn't study it deeply, perhaps we could say some sort of broad thing about potential in Nigeria, or what one would have to look at if they wanted to start studying the viability of commercial investment in Nigeria.
Yeah. So we've taken a approach that's not that different from what we did in the other countries, where you look at income segmentation and consumption of processed products with a particular focus on bread, again, as the sort of entry product and the biggest product, to see what that bread consumption is and to see sort of how that market is evolving, and then compare that to the current growing profile. What we did consistently in each of the countries, and we didn't focus that much on it today because it wasn't the focus of the presentation, but we did make sure that growing OFSP for farmers made sense. So you look at the farm gate price and their yield and what it will result in terms of income for them for a particular plot size, to make sure that this is better than something else they could be doing. So you would always do that analysis so that you don't actually trick farmers into doing something that is actually deterioration of their livelihood from an economic perspective. So you would do that size, and then the market sizing, particularly for domestic consumption for bread and how that evolves. And then the subsequent step, if you see that that leads to potential viable case, then you would be looking at how the cost of wheat in Nigeria and the availability of wheat has been evolving, so to the analysis that CJ showed for Kenya, to see how that compares to the cost of getting OFSP and processing OFSP into bread. And then the subsequent step would be to engage with the bakers to see whether they're interested, so the baking industry, whether they're interested. And that is very linked also to the structure of that industry. So as CJ mentioned, in South Africa, for example, the baking industry is vertically integrated, so almost all bakeries actually own wheat farms. So that it doesn't, and wheat mills. So it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense for them to switch over, because what are they going to do with the wheat that they're growing and that they're owning? So that industry sector actually dispels an opportunity a little. So you would have to look at that as well, to really put yourself in the industry, in the baker's shoes in this case. Like, what is the full-on cost saving and investment that they need to make to start using OFSP?
Great, thank you. We're sitting, Caroline and myself are sitting in Washington, D.C. at USAID headquarters. and CJ is in Kigali, Rwanda. So CJ, just wanted to give an opportunity if you wanted to make any comments on a few of the previous questions as well.
It's always hard to add much thought following someone as sharp as Caroline. I will say to the Nigeria point, knowing what we know about Nigeria, large middle class, large population, I think the study that needs to be run really is a study around structure and cost, as Caroline pointed out. And so I would encourage someone, and maybe that's you, whoever asked the question, to begin to really look at what is the structure of bakeries and processed food, and what are their cost structures and their access to wheat, and what's happening to wheat costs in Nigeria. I think I would hypothesize that smallholder farmers would benefit from growing OFSP, certainly over growing maize or wheat. And so if I were to choose a range of African countries where I would want to do the study next, Nigeria would be high on the list. So to whomever asked that question, I do hope you continue to pursue it and push it.
Thank you, CJ. Your contributions are very much valued from Kigali. Thank you so much. Looking at more questions and comments that keep coming in through the chat windows, we really appreciate everyone's very active participation. Turning back to Caroline, you had mentioned this methodology being used in Tanzania, and I think you mentioned edible oil. So curiosity about which edible oil, and has the methodology been used for other crops in Tanzania?
Yeah, so we've used a variation of this methodology so far on livestock, horticulture, small-scale irrigation technologies, which obviously not a crop, but a supporting tool, as well as sunflower oil in the edible oils space in Tanzania. And just a few words on that edible oils work. Like for many other countries, edible oils in Tanzania is a very big part of their imports, and therefore a big draw on their forex. It's the second biggest commodity or product that they import in terms of volume and value, whereas the country is actually quite suited to grow oilseeds, but local processing of oil to a refined quality, which is what consumers prefer to buy, hadn't led to price parity with imported refined palm oil. And the main reason for that actually was not, as government and researchers and development actors had been thinking for a long time, because of agronomic shortfalls, low yields, and poor seeds at the farmer level, but it was actually because the step that is required to get enough yield on the refinement for sunflower oil to be price competitive with palm oil is a processing step that requires a very large minimum viable scale. So that requires industrial production, whereas most of the processing of oil was farm-size processing, cooperative level processing, which is a mechanical process and doesn't yield enough oil out of those seeds to actually yield a product that is price competitive with imported palm oil. As an interesting side note, Kenyan traders had actually picked up on this opportunity, and what they did was they bought the oily seed cake, which is a residue once you press sunflower oil, brought it to Kenya, processed it there industrially, and then sold both the oil back to Tanzania as well as the de-oily seed cake, which is a really interesting animal feed product. So you take something that is basically waste, an oily seed cake, and you produce it into two very valuable products. Once we had identified that, and we did that with the help of an industrial actor who was at the table from the get-go, what we were able to identify was that there was a very, very healthy business case here for a local FMCG player to set up that industrial scale processing and to start selling homemade, Tanzania-made sunflower oil, refined sunflower oil, and be able to do so profitably at a price that was at or below the price of imported palm oil. But what it required was a clear-eyed look at what stood in the way, which in this case was the way that processing was structured and it not being at viable enough a scale to justify the use of the technology that was required. Interestingly, that meant in terms of support from donors and from the Tanzanian government that the TA type effort and the effort into different seeds and different agronomic practices and increased yield was not necessary for this opportunity to be viable for both the investor and the smallholder farmers. Obviously always helpful to further increase yield and further increase quality, but it was not a stumbling block. And that meant that the government of Tanzania could focus just on its tax policy around the oils, which were necessary to create a bit of a break window in which the oil could come up at price parity.
Great, thank you, Caroline. I know that the work with the Tanzanian government in that case, working on their tax policy was really transformative, not just for the oilseed sector, but then largely in terms of investment promotion and being a more attractive market for others to come in with food processing and other investments. In the course of the analysis on OFSP, how did policy play a role, and if so, how so? I know it wasn't the focus this time, but just curious if it came up in discussions with potential investors or processors.
So the place where policy came up was actually in the international trade, and particularly on the requirements that are placed on food products going into, for example, Europe, which would be the destination market for this food, this shelf-stable puree. That was an interesting opportunity for Kenya. That product goes into, for example, organic baby food, and you can understand that that has a very high bar in terms of quality, traceability, food safety, etc. So it did come up there, and the reason why there's this export opportunity and it hasn't been capitalized on yet is because the opportunity itself is relatively new. So the opportunity, the viable opportunity for fresh is linked, as you rightly said earlier, to the recent availability of cold chain transport. And the opportunity, the viable opportunity for processed OFSP and export is linked to the recent introduction of a FDA-approved technology to produce this shelf-stable puree at a scale that doesn't require a massive industrial setup, but is actually commensurate with how these value chains are structured in a country like Kenya. So a lot of things came together really nicely there, and it was a really innovative US company that has been with us on this journey that has introduced that technology, and their FDA approval basically takes care of that food safety set of requirements to exporting this product.
Caroline, could you share the name of that company?
Sure, I wasn't sure if I could.
The technology?
Yeah, so the company is called Synovatech, and they produce a technology that basically uses microwave technology to create juices and purees of agricultural products of different viscosity levels. And that juices is relatively easy, and making juices shelf-stable is not that hard, but making purees shelf-stable and sterilizing them appropriately is actually technically quite hard because the product can burn very easily with a thermal treatment. So they have come up with a really interesting approach to using a microwave technology there, and they have designed their machinery in such a way that it actually can go to, again, relatively low-scale production. This is not you buy a machine and you put it at farm level and you do it at farm level. It's still a couple of tons a day, and it's still a machine that costs $100,000 to $150,000. But it's not the kind of equipment where a line of processing costs a couple of $1 million and actually needs all of the production of OFSP of an entire country to be running at full speed.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I believe the company is also based in North Carolina in the United States, and I just put up the link to their website if people are interested to look more at the technology and to explore. It's used widely in the United States already, and a lot of potential applications in Africa and elsewhere in the developing world. Wonderful. Looks like we have several more questions coming in. I know that Twanda is busily answering all the technical questions. Thank him very much on sugar content, on a variety of issues. We saw, back to CJ in Rwanda, we saw there was a question on orange flesh sweet potato processing and adoption in Rwanda. And though Of course, that wasn't the focus of the research for this study. CJ, just wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to opine or discuss some opportunities in Rwanda, either on OFSP or this methodology applied to other opportunities in Rwanda.
Yeah, have a bit of a perspective on both. So I will say I like the framing that OFSP has been successful in Rwanda, and I agree. It has been successful, and we've seen some great programs backed by USAID and others to increase the consumption of OFSP in Rwanda. I think we've also seen OFSP attempts to make its way into processing, and we've seen some business actors that I would commend for their innovation and their willingness to step into OFSP begin to try to take on OFSP product production in Rwanda. My sense is that Rwanda has a lot of the similar characteristics that Malawi does. It's a very small population, though we are experiencing incredible economic growth and a booming middle class. We're still a very poor country. We still have a per capita GDP that's much less than half even that of Kenya. And so I think much of what we see in Rwanda is a market that looks a lot like Malawi when it comes to OFSP. And I think, has it been successful? Yes, it's great that we have some really good programs that are ensuring that children and many of the poorest districts have access to increased amounts of OFSP, and we're seeing nutritional advantages there. And I don't want to belittle that because that's incredibly important. Where we have seen attempts to commercialize OFSP in Rwanda, I think the results have been mixed, and I think we've seen perhaps some business cases in niches that are playing out. But to Carline's lens of would I put my pension money there? I don't know. I think we're seeing success, but maybe not on the commercial side. I will pivot a bit and answer the Rwanda more broadly question. And we are engaged in some work with the ISP team and USAID here, looking across a number of value chains right now. And I think there's a range of things that make a crop or a particular value chain in Rwanda particularly competitive. One would be that it is a labor-intensive thing to do that requires little land. We're a hilly country without a lot of flat farmland. And so things like cut flowers or French beans we see doing really well because they can be produced with a lot of inexpensive labor on a small plot of land. The other factor that's often very important in Rwanda is things that are highly perishable. We have great infrastructure and an airline that's becoming better and better at shipping things quickly and coolly directly to Europe. And so the ability to leverage that asset can help us to play in certain value chains, however others, and I think OFSP exports would unfortunately fall into this bucket where some of our neighbors are able to export by sea. We just would run the risk of not being competitive there. So I think I'm excited right now. I'm very excited about horticulture, and we're doing some tests into a range of other value chains, ranging from fish to macadamia nuts to chilies, that I think could be quite interesting, and stay tuned for the output of that work. But for now, very interested in horticulture, not so excited about commercialization in OFSP in Rwanda.
Great, thank you, CJ. We'll take one more question from the very active participants. Thanks everyone for really participating, providing questions as well as resources. This has been a great learning process just over the last hour and a half or so. We'll go to Charles Davis, asks a question on annual income analysis for farmers, how these costs were calculated and what requirements there might be. So I'll turn that over to Carline.
Yeah, it's a great question because it actually allows us to highlight another aspect of the approach. The interesting thing of this approach is that you don't have to do that analysis. And it's a complicated and resource-intense analysis, but it's not needed. Just as when we looked at the consumer preferences and we said instead of asking consumers or doing that analysis, we just look at what's happening in the market. We did something similar when it comes to the farmer-processor dynamics. There is a market clearing price. There's a price at which the farmers sell this product and a price at which the producers, therefore, or the processors buy that product. And given that farmers have alternatives in both selling this produce at the fresh market as well as over multiple seasons, obviously choosing whether or not to plant this crop, one can assume that that clearance price is a price that holds viability for the farmer. Now, if the focus of this work had been to look at maximizing economic livelihoods for farmers and choosing exactly which crop and which production method would be optimal, then obviously we would have gone into a lot of depth there. I'm not saying that this approach touches on everything that's relevant, but it actually allows you to say, we look at what's happening in the market, and particularly in a market that is actually quite nascent, like OFSP processing, where there isn't yet a dynamic of one very big buyer that the farmers have no choice but to sell to that buyer and are completely price takers. That's actually not the reality of the current markets because it's so nascent. So that's another reason to believe that that market clearing price is actually not an exploitative price that represents a power disbalance. So that's an interesting aspect of this methodology. As to your question on the water use, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that, and I therefore cannot answer whether
we did look into water use and water access.
Sorry,
and the other piece that we did look into was not necessarily the cost of producing OFSP from the perspective of how do we get to the precise income increase for a farmer, because as Caroline pointed out, some of those costs are pretty small and don't feed into the overall story. But the one thing that was important for us to understand was, could smallholder farmers access what they needed to produce it? And so, for example, if rootstock for OFSP were to be very, very expensive, prohibitively expensive, that would be a bad sign, and that would actually be a barrier. And so we did validate that rootstock was available. It's increasingly available in better and better and better quantities and conditions and varietals due to the hard work of SIP. So thank you, Simone and Tawanda, who are actively continue to be answering questions, I think, because that work has made this more viable from an input perspective. And then on water, it consumes less water. I mean, pretty much what people in the 3 countries we looked at that are not growing OFSP, the opportunity cost for the base case is maize. And so OFSP is both more resilient and easier for a farmer from an input standpoint than maize. So it's actually a better crop all around.
Great. Thank you, CJ. Participants will notice that there's a number of questions that are brought up on the screen. So please go ahead and review the questions. We're interested in your feedback, your interests also going forward. This, of course, is not the end of this discussion, but just one point as we are working deeply either in orange flesh sweet potato or other food commodities in Africa or beyond, but thinking about how we can apply this commercialization methodology to understanding, will products, or is it likely that products will scale based on private sector appetite, and is that a realistic kind of development hypothesis or thesis that will be proven out in market dynamics? So quite important to this work in many countries, not just the Kenya, Malawi, South Africa, but we see many, Nigeria, Ghana, Rwanda, lots of countries have come up in the course of this conversation. So moving to our last few minutes, Caroline, I'll turn to you for a few takeaways in terms of the content. What should people, in just a few discrete points, be really distilling and taking away from this presentation today?
So in terms of content, if you look across the 3 countries, I would say from a development perspective and accelerating that flywheel of economic growth, focus on the opportunities in Kenya. Do not focus on the opportunities in South Africa because they just don't have enough development relevance. And when engaging in Malawi, be mindful of the fact that the commercial and investment opportunities are limited, and the outlook for that currently isn't all that good. you may still want to engage because it still has nutritional benefits, it still offers opportunities for farmers, but you should do so with realistic expectations as to what the private sector engagement will be.
And just to clarify, we just looked at the processing for pureed orange flesh sweet potatoes.
Yes.
So we did not take a look at the fresh market opportunities or other things.
Correct.
So just to be very clear on that.
Yeah. Puree or other like chips and fries, and that's not a puree, but processing is what we looked at, yes.
And then in Kenya?
So in Kenya, yes, do like that across the 3 countries, focus on Kenya. Many of you have commented on the interesting opportunity that exists for export. We are very excited about that. The more domestic opportunity around bread baking is also viable. It doesn't have as much of a margin and a buffer as people have also picked up from our numbers, and does require that wheat market to come in sync a little bit more with the global trends on wheat pricing.
Great, thank you. And then, Caroline, in terms of takeaways on the methodology that we utilized, because though we studied orange flesh sweet potato deeply, really this is an approach that kind of USAID and other donors, as we see specific practices, services, technologies that can come in and really have the opportunity to be transformative in the agriculture sector, we want to know what are the opportunities for that technology or innovation to scale, and if that scaling process is likely to happen through a commercial pathway. So how can this methodology be applied, and what are some key takeaways to understand what to be looking for?
Yeah, I think there's a few key takeaways. One is make sure that you understand what will drive demand and be realistic and clear-eyed about that. I remember the first big presentation we had in this project in Malawi when we were talking about demand, and a question from the audience came, well, if we just told people how healthy it was, wouldn't they start eating? And we had actually just finished a tea break where the deep-fried snacks had gone like crazy, and they were just completely finished within a couple of minutes. And I told the audience, I'm sure you all know that those weren't the healthiest snacks for you, but still they were finished within 2 minutes. So let's be clear-eyed and not kid ourselves about where demand is going to come from, and just telling people about how healthy a product is will actually not generate demand and will not generate an investor interest. So take a very good understanding of demand, segment it smartly, the way we have done around the domestic growth, import substitution, and export opportunity, and understand that. The second key takeaway would be take an investor perspective and do so relatively ruthlessly, because, and that's not to kill all other interesting opportunities, but to make sure that you focus on the things that really can have a transformative impact. This export opportunity from Kenya exists, but it's by no means completely ready to go without any form of support, because it needs different parties to come to the table. It's a Novatech, transport, a buyer from Europe, and that will need engagement and support, which in my opinion should probably be spent on that rather than on many smaller opportunities for maybe like school feeding programs, if you want to look at the commercial opportunity and not just the nutritional benefits. So make sure that you take an investor-led approach and do so relatively ruthlessly to help yourself prioritize. And then the last, I would say, is those two will help you in your analysis focus on the things you truly need to understand, so that you don't have to spend time on things that you don't, for this effort, need to understand. So to the consumer preferences, the farmer pricing, the things that we spoke about, you can use a lot of what's actually happening in the market as pointers for that reality, and the reality that investors will take as cues.
Great, thank you so much, Caroline. Well, we're wrapping up this webinar today. Wanted to thank again CJ Fonzie and Kadalia Rwanda. Thank you for joining CJ. Thanking Caroline Nauman in Washington, D.C. with us. Also thanking Tawanda for being very active in the chat box and providing lots of critical technical answers throughout the webinar. And then finally, thank you to everyone at AgriLinks for